Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week, once again, is Richard Doyle. Rich is the first guest to appear twice on the podcast, which should be an indication of how much we enjoyed speaking last time. Rich is an author and professor of English and of Information Sciences and Technology at Pennsylvania State University, and he also goes by the alias Mobius. Today we had a loose, unplanned discussion around non-duality, as well as personal and societal transformation. I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, got my coffee lined up, my water, my paper and pen.
Got my tea and water. British American difference, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, we just, probably. Yeah, no, it's my most abused drug is coffee for sure.
Yeah.
Meaning that I push the edges of how I use it. I'm much better about it than I used to be, but I was an abusive coffee drinker all through graduate school just to do the work.
I mean, when I was much younger, I used to feel like I didn't really feel the effects of coffee. I feel like it wouldn't really register with me, and
didn't do it.
But then when I started doing the kind of, like we spoke about last time, embodied psychedelic kind of trauma healing, I guess you could say, now I really feel it. Like now I can read my body better. Like my interoception's just gone through the roof.
That's a really interesting topic, right? That I'm convinced that a lot of the healing that I've got to experience, and you too, has to do with just increasing capacity and fidelity on that kind of self-repair circuits, if I can put it that way, that we're more attentive and discerning about our own bodily states. And so then you can start to debug.
Yeah, I mean, the fidelity is an interesting way of putting it, because it seems to me like the signals are always there, but it's the kind of the overwhelm, the fear in the past, the aversion, the stuff that's still in the system that's too much that keeps you from tuning into it. So it's a weird thing that, like, when I would drink too much coffee many years ago, presumably I was still having a tingling, feeling in my stomach, or like my breathing was shallow. I just wasn't reading it as kind of a slightly anxious, unpleasant sensation. I would just be kind of shut off from it. So I think you're right. There's like attentional tuning into it.
Yes. And that makes the, endless psychonautical tweaking of even one's coffee intake a sort of joyful journey, because you are going to mess up, right? Like, this is why I always think it's such if there's any classic trope of like the trip report, it's the mistake, right? That
I've really done it this time. I've broken my brain.
Exactly. And that to me, it belies the like experimental space that one is like has to approach with actually a kind of fierce rigor, lest one really suffer the consequences, like working with power tools, I mean, you become casual enough with a chainsaw, you're going to lose your finger, right? So I've seen instances of ontological shock, as people are now calling it, precisely in people who otherwise were quite well tuned to their own kind of phenomenology, if we can put it that way, that they noticed the micro differences. And that can be a challenge, because it means if you're ill, that you're really noticing a lot of the degrees of your own suffering in a way, and that you have to notice those degrees of suffering in order to tend to them, right? Because otherwise, if you just try to shut it out, as you put it before, and just more like just kind of, I don't know, compartmentalize the pain, compartmentalize the illness. I always thought of it or experienced it as a kind of closeting of the illnesses, that I was hiding them away, suppressing them. And I did that because paying close attention and discerning the differences that were occurring in my body was not pleasant. Right. But it appears to be the case that until you take delivery, as it were, of those messages and let them go, right, then that's just going to keep doing that.
Yeah.
That there's a kind of mess that has to be discharged. I find that particularly interesting about eczema,
Right.
that you have to really go to the root of that stress that is the very the itch,
It's like the
the
existential
pulse.
itch that causes the physical itch.
Yes, and then which there's a feedback loop then, right? And there is a kind of visionary quality to any kind of a significant eczema experience. You have a big area and it's intense. Your comparisons to the cross are not completely inappropriate, and but also just the vision quest itself of kind of highly distributed pain, that pain over such a large area that the only solution is to not give it a target, that like you have to melt into the pain, you have to accept the pain, you can't try to manage it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm really be interested in like how teachable is that? Can people, do people within pain management sort of recognize that?
I mean, the way you frame this, it really speaks to me, and the way that it's kind of like I think the way we both approach this is as a kind of perpetual game of hide and seek, where you're kind of seeing where you're holding, seeing what you're hiding from yourself, whether it's meditation or a psychedelic journey, or and no matter how subtle things get, there's always some hiding, evasion, something. You never. I'm fairly convinced that you don't plateau at this place of perfect, enlightened kind of like, yep, nothing ever comes up. And if
Let's
you do feel that
not.
way, yeah, exactly. Like something eventually, if nothing's coming up for you, it's probably some good fortune. Like eventually something will come up that could potentially disturb your peace. And then, but yeah, so I mean, this can be on a very subtle level, as say, whether it's meditation or in a journey. For me, I guess I'm in this place of, after many years of, part of me, I feel like recently I kind of realized part of me was assuming I would plateau in some way, that I would find a place where I'm like, okay, I'm pretty much done now. Like I'm a finished product. And
Yes.
instead it's like, oh no, there's a little bit here, a little bit there.
Yes, and in fact, there's a kind of surprise quality
right.
to the return of some aspect of the repressed that you were absolutely certain that you had dealt with, right? And but a lot of times, just back for a funny visit, third time's the farce, right? You know what I mean? But I do think that there's this kind of ridiculous idea that one's going to get out of life. Right.
Right.
The tribulation itself is going to cease, rather than that you've acquired a set of practices that allow you to navigate the tribulation in a way that seems to leave you stronger every time. Right.
I mean, this is
as opposed to forms of tribulation that injure and damage.
These kinds of, I mean, the kind of non-dual states that we both talk about, like, I feel like to me they're always the point of connecting with them is to inform living on the kind of relative level. It's not to transcend or escape. And what you said then really evoked for me the feeling of, the whole point of enlightenment traditionally is to get off the cycle of rebirth, right? Get out of life, just like make it all stop. I want to get off the ride and like truly transcend. Whereas to me, it's really about like, know these things are there, use them to come into feeling more grounded, more part of the flow of being part of nature, but then live your life as a natural process. And that's not going to be a state of transcendence or, getting off the ride.
We're Darwinian beings, man. Right? I mean,
through and through.
That we're caught up in this fabulous evolutionary epic. This is why the Bhagavad Gita is such a powerful spiritual text, opening with a war, because it's not just war, right? It's also the ability to navigate the war, and the ability to live in ahimsa, right? To live in peace, to achieve the state in which there is no war. So it's just that we, I think it's very clearly a product of the, almost the consumer culture, spiritual materialism aspect of something like non-duality culture or psychedelic culture, where it's just like, I want to get to the finish line. I want to get the gold ring. I want to be the bodhisattva. And it's like, okay, great on all those things that you want, that like enthusiasm for the overcoming of who we already are. Yes, right. But there are infinite layers and folds
Right.
to explore in the journey. And so, I don't wish to get out of life. I think it was the Aurobindo. I'm sure many people have said this, but I think Aurobindo put it about, being in the world, but not of it.
Right.
In other words, that, which kind of names, that's why I like the Mobius strips so much, right? Because the inside and the outside kind of swap places, all continuously. And so this idea, of sort of allowing that inside and outside, quote unquote, instability, which can always often seem like an instability, to be a kind of dissolution into the absolute, right? Which, because it goes beyond inside or outside. And so you're in the world, like I feel like I experience the world maybe more intensely every day. More intensely is a kind of very inadequate word, but there's a because we're involved in the feedback loop, right? That the nature of the attention that I focus on my own experience then feeds back on itself, and there's infinite layers to explore, right? Like just exploring the plants in my own environment and the way in which they interact with my consciousness, right? I harvested some garlic mustard last night, right, which is a invasive plant that came to the colonies in the 18th century, which people used as a medicinal herb and as a salad, as a edible. And man, it was delicious and fun, and it's got a little bit of cyanide in it, so you got to chop it like rumors of its cyanide, I think, are, I don't know, not exaggerated, but like, yeah, okay, you just chop it up and it's fine. You're all right. But I think some people are sensitive to it. But the point is, those feedback loops abound, and that's just one of them, right? And so, starting to know the bird song of the region that I'm living in, right? Then, as my awareness is captured more by that bird song, then I learn even more of it, and I start singing back to them, right? Which they seem to appreciate, right? They seem to like John Coltrane, and so being involved in that, like, to me, that doesn't sound like getting out of life at all. That sounds like tuning to the ecodelic imperative of learning how to integrate ourselves in the environments we find ourselves in a way that is sustainable on every level, including the level of physical and mental health and wellness and thriving. Right.
That really resonates with my experience over the last couple of years. As I mentioned last time, I've been building this retreat center in Portugal, and when we arrived on this piece of land, it was our concern was that it was quite in this huge valley, and there didn't seem to be that much nature. Really, there were the trees, and but there didn't seem to be that much life that I could see. And then, as you live there, suddenly everything starts coming out of the woodwork, and you realize it's obviously like teeming with nature, lizards and hedgehogs and wild boar at night, and like all of this. And you start to tune into the different things. And I mean, one of the first experiences we had was of I thought a motorbike had started up about a meter away from me when I was in the middle of nowhere. Turns out it was a partridge taking flight, and they make this like incredible loud noise. And then, you start to identify different things. And so definitely matches what you said. And on the point of being of the world, being in the world but not of the world,
Yes.
it makes me reach for some teachings of Jesus that not going to be able to to identify, but that you may be able to, because I
Try
feel
me.
like
Yeah.
in a kind of mystical reading of Jesus' teachings, I feel like there's a lot of this pointing towards identifying as the absolute, the thing that is the unconditioned. And the phrase that comes to mind is "can't touch this," but I feel like that's not what Jesus said. That might be paranoid. That could be
or
another savior.
I am me and you are we and we are all together.
Right. I'm saying
Right. I
we
mean,
could do a book of
it's the book
misattributing
of
quotes to
John
Jesus.
oneness. Yeah. That yeah, it's the pathway to immanence, right?
Right.
And no, well, my favorite line on that, again, to loop back to the Mobius strip, which I kind of disappeared into there for a moment, is in the Gospel of Thomas, which I love very much. And, you know, as you know, is not included in the Bible, but like, at least like by first principles, you can see that it's included not because of what it includes, because it includes things that are also in the book of Luke, right? And it's probably older than the book of Luke, by my understanding. But that it's not a narrative of the life of Jesus. It's direct teachings from Jesus to his disciples. And so therefore it kind of doesn't do the work of the rest of the Gospels,
Right.
and it would kind of stick out. But if you read it and he says, and they say, Master, you know, how do I get into the kingdom? Right. And Jesus says, you know, behold the babe, you know, being suckled by her mother. When you make the inside the outside and the outside the inside, then you have entered the kingdom, right? And so, you know, we can think of agape as an avenue for that, right? Where when you can find the selfless love that is more or less visualized, illuminated, right, by a mother nursing a child, can't touch this, right? You know what I mean? Like it's you have found a place without any egoic location, and so therefore there is no target for you to be crucified upon, if that if
Right.
that makes sense, right? You know, so so yeah, no, I love the mystical interpretation of Jesus. I it took me a long time to open to that, but it's been a wonderful slow
Yeah.
jam.
I
And
feel I feel like maybe the line was
uh
the one about the hanging up your worries where moth and dust doth corrupt. Something there's something in there about
yeah,
the kind of the transience and the
yeah,
conditioned and
don't exactly don't pile up your treasures where the treasures and moth do corrupt them,
right.
right? So it's vanity of vanity from Ecclesiastes again. It's just like, hey, all this stuff is just gonna go away. You got to find the eternal, right? So, and then, you know, Bhagavad Gita, it's aham atma gurukesha sarva bhuta asya sitaha, like, you know, find the unchanging. It's Moses and the burning bush, right? I think isn't that funny that we call it the burning bush? Because what does he notice about it? He notices, in fact, that it's not burning,
Right.
right? You know, he says, I will stop and look aside and see why this bush is not burnt,
I
right?
think
It's almost like he's speaking to the audience
yeah,
too.
that really captures the kind of, I especially like this in the kind of Tibetan teachings. There's a lot of this focus on kind of how consciousness and the world, the way the world is illuminated in it, is empty. It's unconditioned. It's not changing, but it's radiantly potent.
Yes,
And it feels like a similar thing with the
yes,
burning bush. It's like it's this potent thing, but actually it's unconditioned.
yes. And you know, you can go into the Greek and you know, even imagine a word like physis, right, which is like the life coming out of the earth. Physis is a trope for that, right, which is different from zoon, if
I've
I
not heard
remember
of that.
correctly.
What's the etymology of physis? Or how's it spelt?
Physis,
Or what's the
well, you know, I'm no Greek scholar, but you know, transliterated PHYSIS, and it goes back in through Aristotle, and it's a kind of figure for, you know, not only I think it's a, yeah, it's a figure for the vitality of the earth itself in some ways, right? Like it's not like what Dark Sun has later going to talk about is sort of elan vital, although they have things in common. And I do think that there's a purposive quality to it, that it's teleological, right? That everything is trying to live in a certain way, which I think certainly from a first-person subjective phenomenological point of view is a more interesting way to live in the world than as if it weren't, right? Like that just because it violates some taboos on how we think about the scientific method doesn't make it a good equipment for living.
Yeah, I mean, I think purpose does
writer
exist
Kenneth Ford.
from our perspective, right, from within our minds. And I mean, this is an interesting question, like when you have these experiences of feeling deeply grounded in being the unfolding universe, I think it's really common to then introspect, take properties of what I would argue is the mind, and then say, well, these must be the properties of the universe. And so you get the kind of, since Vedic times, ideas that the universe is consciousness, the universe is teleological. I feel like, in a kind of Kantian way, that like, well, really that's the bedrock of our mind, which is still part of the universe, but there's still some kind of crazy noumenal, shenanigans going on out there in the quantum realm that we can't really imagine, that's thrust us into existence. What's your take on that?
Well, I think they come together. It's interesting. I think they come together in Kant. I would point you to, I'd love to have your take on a really brilliant but somewhat lesser known writer that you might have seen in my writings before, Franklin Merrill Wolff, who was a mathematician very much in the early 20th century, lived to be 98 in California. He was a professor at Stanford, trained at Harvard, and then he quit because he wanted to figure out essentially what math was. And he found in Kant's synthetic a priori, the apperception, the prior unity, to be a kind of reconciling principle that through the direct inspection of consciousness, we can experience that apperception of unity. And so there's a kind of rapport there, if that makes sense, with Kant. I actually don't think that Vedanta is arguing most of the time that there is nothing but consciousness, but that we, in order to think beyond the matter consciousness binary that we find ourselves implicated in as evolutionary beings, right? It sure seems like matter is what matters, right? And so then therefore we tend to kind of like forget consciousness, that you want to kind of get John 1:1 on it and say, in the beginning was the word, and flip your usual perspective for the sake of the Gestalt shift, not because it really all comes first. And I think that if we, where maybe I doubt we part company here, but maybe where some terminology might get in the way is that I think that, what Kant left out is that by direct inspection of our own consciousness, what Franklin Merrill Wolff called introception, right? We can actually perceive and the nature of our own mind as well as the content of our own mind. And when we can perceive the nature of our own mind, it is advaita, right? Not two, right? It's neither material nor conscious, but beyond both in some sense. And that allows us to, of course, preserve the, as you wonderfully put it, the shenanigans happening in the quantum realm. I mean, things are manifesting, right? I think is what you're saying. But yes, that difficulty of simply conflating our own inspection of our minds with the nature of the conscious of the universe itself. I think is why we're lucky to have so many fabulous teachers who've gone before us and written it down and saying, okay, I see. If I imagine that Dharmakaya, right, that divine ground, as Huxley would have put it, but they wouldn't, right? But Dharmakaya, that as primordial wakefulness, as the translation treats it in Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche's, then when you feel primordial wakefulness, you don't feel just consciousness, right? You feel like vim, even a word I like, you know, a kind of energy that's happening. You're like ready to go. You're waking up, right? You know, and so that's why, you know, those poets and bards and teachers are such treasures for us. Why we really do have bodhisattvas across time, whatever our perspective is, because they've written that stuff down. They've made paintings, and we get to go, okay, like, I'm not going to fall for a philosophical position.
Right.
You know,
I mean,
like,
I really like the primordial wakefulness way of phrasing it in the kind of Tibetan tradition. And I mean, part of something here is that when we, you know, the way that consciousness illuminates the world is it feels deeply primordial. It's not about concept. It's just bam, like we exist and it's illuminated. And so it feels fundamental. It feels like bedrock. But I guess what I would argue is like when we're looking back in time, well, the origin of life, abiogenesis, was really the Big Bang from our perspective. Before abiogenesis, before life came into existence, again, we've got this weird quantum, who knows what, you know, can't really say much about it, except physicists do. But I think this is how you can kind of reconcile an emergent picture of consciousness with the idea that it really feels fundamental and in a sense is fundamental, because emergent phenomena really exist, right? Like I'm an emergent phenomenon bodily at this scale. I really exist. Like, but we have this feeling that to be emergent is to be lesser than like what really exists in the little building blocks, particles.
Yeah. No, in fact, I think it's a much richer way of imagining oneself than imagining oneself as a material entity, for example.
Right.
If you say, actually, practice every day realizing that you're an emergent phenomenon on this scale, and like what that means. Scales, and that's what happens. Yes, exactly. And so that's just really good old metaphor hacking, right? That you're saying like, I'm not saying it's true that emergence is more characteristic, but if I experiment with emergence as being a part of these nested descriptions that I can really give of the life world and the nature of our place within it as given to us by falsifiable science, right? Then I find that in fact my sense of what being is enriched and enlivened. And for example, I can understand a little bit better, I think, like what did Jacob Boehme, for example, great German mystic, you know, Hegel called him the first German philosopher, and he's very difficult to read, right? But when you read him, as Philip K. Dick did, and you experiment with the language of like, oh, he's experiencing himself as a multi-layered emergent being who doesn't have the kind of localization and space-time that he thought he did. Does that make sense, right? Because he's a dynamic, self-aware system, then we can start to decode some of how he's writing about his experiences as having like a sense of ubiquity, right? And a sense of primordialness, the Urgrund, right? The ground beyond being, even. Right? And then we can experiment with that metaphor too, saying, oh, well, maybe experimenting with ideas around the Urgrund helps us think about emergence, right? As, you know, Metron and Varela, you know, certainly knew their Heidegger, right? Like they understood their Heidegger, and they were kind of on that Jacob Boehme lineage in a certain way on that front. So, no, I think we're probably closer on that issue than we think. But I just find that it's very pedagogically helpful for people to experiment with the consciousness first hypothesis, because it's so unthinkable to them, because they live in a reality which is, you know, set up and reinforced as being a, you know, matter first reality, which also isn't so. Right.
Yeah. I think
because it leaves out the emergent qualities.
Right. You know, exactly. A matter only ontology, right, is the main one that science goes with. And I guess the way that I tend to encounter the consciousness only thinking is I see these, ancient texts that all point to the non-conceptual, the unnameable, whether it's Brahman, Tao, whatever you want to call it, it's boom, the thing that like is so big, so beyond concepts, it cannot be named. And I think the wisdom of the path is in moving away from concepts, seeing what happens when you drop concepts, and when you realize that the mind is non-dual, it's because it's not divided conceptually in the way you thought it was. When you realize your relationship to the physical world is non-dual as well, and again, it's concepts falling away. We're always chunking up this one reality into these different concepts, right? But then I see that, the mind is very sneaky and it loves concepts. So you go through all this, people go, okay, I get it. So what really they're saying is Brahman is consciousness, or Tao is consciousness. And and like, no. It's not that simple. It's not that conceptual. You can't just plug in a concept there and say, and now we're done, right? I think everyone should admit that, like, surely it's like, to be the non-conceptual, it has to be more subtle than that. It can't be that you can just say it equals consciousness and we're done.
No, you have to show your work. In other words, like, so for example, the Mandukya Upanishad, I love the Mandukya Upanishad because I think it's the shortest Upanishad. It's an old one. And it's essentially an algorithm for practicing Om as a chant in order to achieve Turiya, the so-called fourth state of consciousness. And it does so by teaching the chanter or the reader how to point their mind first to waking consciousness, then to dreaming consciousness. Essentially ask and look and say, if you'll follow it. So, I mean, I agree entirely. You can't just have the equation. You have to have the algorithm by which a willing practitioner can reasonably be expected to try to carry that out, right? And then not try to carry that with a whole lot of obstacles. Like, I shouldn't have to do 100,000 prostrations first, although it's probably good practice, right? You know what I mean? Like, that I should be able to, as Socrates teaches the slave, the Pythagorean theorem in Plato's The Meno, right? Somebody should be able to sit down with somebody of, ordinary capacities and reflective awareness and saying, like, okay, look, let's talk about the fact that you have that the Mandukya Upanishad says that there are 4 aspects to consciousness, and that you had forgotten that. So let's lead you through that. So if after doing that, the practitioner, and giving it a serious amount of time and practicing meditation. So I guess there are some serious obstacles, but even chanting, I have found, I'm really excited about the new research that's coming out on just Om chanting and the deactivation of the default mode network. It matches my first person experience, and it matches my experience teaching students, where a lot of them who won't meditate or, find it impossible to continue to meditate, if they chant, they get some of the same kind of subjective benefits. So that's what I would say. I would say, you're quite right that, like, when the equal sign comes in, concepts snap back into dogmatic place, as it were. But to me, that's always the challenge between what Huxley called the exoteric aspect of religion and the esoteric aspect of religion, where the esoteric aspect of religion is so coupled with practice, right, that those sorts of ossifications have to fall away, right? Because in practice, no concept is going to be up to a non-dual state.
You mentioned the prostrations and all the preparations that people have to do in the kind of Eastern religions, usually before getting exposed to these kinds of teachings, and these kinds of exoteric, things where it's like, you can't go straight for the juicy stuff. You've got to do all the ritual and things like that. I think, like a lot of, maybe it's a Western condition or something, but I definitely had a feeling of wanting to go straight for the jugular of the kind of really where the core of this stuff is. I mean, it mainly happened. My initial interest came from a kind of vivid spiritual experience, so I felt like, why should I bother faffing around with the other stuff?
I think that's a more generous way of putting it, which is, that those of us who have gotten lit up, even within the culture that we were raised in here, of technoscience and cultural materialism, that we're like, hey, I need help. Okay,
Right,
like
right.
I've glimpsed a vastness over here. You know, like Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert were going to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, not because they thought it was cool or more advanced, but because they were like, wow, we really need some framework here for navigating
Right.
these experiences that we're totally unprepared to have.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I think you're right.
That's my more generous interpretation. I do see plenty of that, though, of course, where, like, you know, or somebody wants to take mushrooms once and just, like, you know, be enlightened or something. It's
Right. I
like,
mean,
well,
I was going to raise that earlier, that there's this rhetoric in the studies of this, which is valuable, you know, to show like in one session people have a huge reduction in depression, and that's really useful to show how powerful these things are. But then I think the slight problem is the narrative has now become like, and you're cured. Like, just come in for one session, you're done. And it goes back to what we were saying before of the game of hide and seek being a work in progress. I think that's not really a healthy way that the culture could use something like psychedelics to engage in kind of this kind of work would be on an ongoing basis, right? As part of a journey, not come in, get it prescribed, have it done. It's a procedure, and then I'm healed and perfect.
it's a practice, not a procedure. It's
Right,
a
right.
practice, not a procedure. And as a practice, there's no such thing as a one-time shot practice. That doesn't mean you have
Yeah.
to keep taking, yeah, you have to keep taking mushrooms, but let's just suppose you do. You are lucky, you have a nice mushroom experience, you get some insight, and then you keep, like, in preparation for the experience, you started practicing meditation. After the experience, you start practicing, you know, keep your practice going. And I've observed that many people experience a kind of real deepening and capacity for meditation after even a 1 gram psychedelic psilocybin experience. Um, that's going to be much more likely to get the healing efficacy that we're looking for, you know, out of these experiences, if we frame it right as a practice. That's just what I've observed, both from my own life and just observing other people who I've corresponded with and whatnot. And if anything, that can be more of a service industry. Like, in other words, like, it shifts the focus from having a proprietary molecule or even knowledge about that molecule and towards the context of care, right? And support for the practice, right? So that's where, you know, when you said you're building a retreat, I have a feeling that, just like, I hope that retreats and wellness centers are cropping up all over the place, because that's what we need to fill that gap, where people say, yeah,
Yeah.
look, well, there's some kind of reliable techniques that you can prioritize here, and there are a suite of responses to integrating these insights, because that's the part that also, of course, gets left out, right? It's like, if I had, as we talked about this last time, if I hadn't been healed of major illnesses, I'm absolutely certain I would have figured out a way to simply closet and suppress the experiences I had on ayahuasca, because nothing else in my life would have allowed them to be integrated as a kind of indigestible post-ontological nugget you swallow. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, things undreamed of by your philosophy, Horatio, right? But because it introduced me to a zeal for life, a love of life, a capacity for love that is, you know, of course, not unproblematic, but only increased, you know, in my capacities for agape. I say not unproblematic because the first 7 years or so, as I think I mentioned to you, I was sort of, I mean, shouting it from the rooftops even more than I am now, right? Which was like, uh, And, I hope I wasn't too annoying to people. It always was coming from a place of just, you guys, I can't believe it. Like something I never thought I could be healed of in my life, which is like feeling the way I felt.
Right.
Plus all these physical symptoms. I'm healed. Like I'm a completely different being in that sense. I'm N.0. So I wanted to share that. But as we're saying, and as you've observed, it's very hard work, and it's even the smartest, most caring, most hardworking people find it akin to the cross. So
yeah, and I think there's that. I mean, the point we were saying earlier about the kind of exoteric teachings and all the procedures that the general population might be advised to go through in traditional religions. I feel like we're at this point where the current overarching framework is so misguided. So we're so lost in our kind of conceptual framework of the world, where we feel ourselves to be truly separate from nature, humans to be exceptional, amongst the natural world. All of that's so misguided that we're looking for the right answer. And I think this kind of ecodelic vision of a non-dual world in which we're a thermodynamic process that's not separate from the rest of nature is the correct lens. It's the most appropriate lens in which everything starts to fall into place. And then, so when if you make that leap and you think, okay, like this is the answer, then I think there's an instinct maybe to look for similar elegant answers in other areas. So for me, I'm captivated by the issue of kind of societal discord and what from this non-dual perspective can we learn about how to move in a healthier perspective. And then I find as I spend the years and years like reading about history and sociology and all this stuff, and I try to think, okay, like how do I distill this? How do I compress it down into an elegant model? I find the model is just describing the situation. So it's like people behave like assholes because they're assholes is the kind of thing where it's like you can't compress it anymore. It's like, I mean, behind that there's a deep understanding of like, they've gone through trauma that's made them like this, and or maybe there's genetic things that's made them preoccupied with the competitive aspect of Darwinian evolution. So you can unpack it all, but there's a strange thing where your models suddenly they don't compress anymore. So when you have, I have this experience with non-duality as well. We may have spoken about this last time, but I feel like it can flickers from nothingness to everythingness, where it's like in one moment I could have an experience of non-duality that's like almost extinguished, like no form, and then another experience, I mean this especially in the kind of psychedelic state, it's like your experience is fractal, geometric, writhing, vivid in every sensory modality, and that's another full way of thinking about kind of non-duality. So there's this interesting thing, I think, where you take this shortcut to the correct framing, but then everything else becomes this. There's a lot to be said about how the world is structured, how you map it, and that fits in with maybe it is unwise for everyone to suddenly turn on with psychedelics and then without having any framework, and then you see all the wisdom and why these teachings are there. So I feel like there's going to be this. We need the shock treatment of kind of bam, like enough people take psychedelics or get involved in meditation or whatever it is, but then there will be the inevitable. We can't just jettison all of the nuanced practice and prostrations and ritual and all that other stuff that will have to come in after.
No, I agree that, we're really talking about building an entirely different kind of collective infrastructure of being, right? Yeah. And I want to give a lot of credit, of course, to the, indigenous knowledges and counterculture knowledges that actually did a remarkable job in the 60s and 70s. Like we like to look back and kind of paint it as an utter disaster in order to differentiate what's happening now from it, which is, convenient and maybe necessary. But I think when you look at the kind of rich history of, people like Myron Stolaroff, right, great psychedelic researcher there in Lone Pine, California, who lived down the hill, by the way, from the aforementioned Franklin Merrill Wolf, who was involved in research with Shogun, right? He would help test the compounds that Shogun was coming up with. Shogun, of course, and his groups and the way in which they worked together. and as the yogis say, held space for each other, and so forth. So I think that the wisdom is out there, but not if we are to loop back, not if we're essentially making it fit into the magic bullet theory again,
right.
where it's just like, yeah, you can just show up. I have, I've met people who've gone to, ketamine clinics, and it helped them. In fact, they lost their suicidal ideation by their own report, but they also felt in kind of complete ontological shock based on the sort of poor handling of set and setting in the clinic, where it's just about it's again single bullet, magic bullet theory. It's just like, give the shot, get the cure. It's like, that's not how it works. Okay,
right.
It's just essentially a fundamental agreement. Now, just looping back to your going through history, sociology, assholes equals assholes thing, which I really liked. It reminded me of Terence McKenna talking about Finnegan's Wake as all of human history. He doesn't say being vomited up, but I was being vomited up as a kind of cosmic detritus. Telling the same damn story over and over again. But I do think that what's specific about right now, as we mentioned last time, is that we're coming into a awareness that this egoic pandemic is the obstacle, right? I think we were in accord last time that people are assholes because they're egoic, essentially, right. And they're assholes because they've been traumatized into thinking that they live in a Darwinian context that is only composed of war, and that symbiosis is completely, a fantasy, when in fact, as we know, right, symbiotic aspect of evolution, since that biogenesis that you, I think, rightly named as our real Big Bang, right? I mean, it'd be interesting to run that through the kind of John Wheeler notion of it from bit, where,
I think that takes you to
that invention of a, yes, exactly. Which again is a little bit like what I was talking about before pedagogically. Let's experiment with that point of view so that we can at least get a gestalt shift on the physics-centric qualities, that the beginning begins with, when there's some quantum event, right? And it's like, well, let's look at the biogenesis moment. That's the moment that we're on a continuity with, right? Because if we're emergent, we're an emergent structure across space-time, precisely with that biogenic event, right? Which continues on through us, right? That there is a kind of primordial wakefulness quotient there to right. Biogenesis, if that makes sense. So I think I wanted to say one other thing, because you were saying about the fullness and emptiness business, is that this is why I love, I'm working on a piece right now on chanting, and I love the little nugget in the middle of the Heart Sutra, which is Rupam Sunyata Sunyataiva Rupam, right? Form is emptiness, emptiness right. Form. And you can sort of fill it up and empty it out. Rupam Sunyata Sunyataiva Rupam, right? You're filling it up and you're emptying it out. And it has to have both of those aspects, right? In other words, that the sunyata works for me as from a subjective point of view, not as a scholar, but as a kind of way of allowing for there to be a space between and beyond thoughts, right? So what happens when there are no thoughts there? I had never, probably until I was 50, well, no, let's see, 94, whatever, 40, then I hadn't said, oh, can you observe your own thoughts and what's there when there aren't any thoughts, right? Rupam Sunyata Sunyataiva Rupam. And so all of these traditions, they just have all of these beautiful tools laying around. Now, we don't just want to appropriate them, of course. I give due respect to the traditions that have transmitted all of these things. But nonetheless, Rupam Sunyata Sunyataiva Rupam is not proprietary knowledge. And anybody can chant it, Rupam Sunyata Sunyataiva Rupam. And while you're chanting it, you're not an egoic asshole. You know what I mean? Like, you might be before and after, but while you're chanting it, you can observe Rupam Sunyata Sunyataiva Rupam, right? It's that chiasmatic form. It's like Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath, is Jesus's inversion. It's that fill it up, empty it out, right? Form that it really is a kind of neurotechnology, linguistic neurotechnology, that we just sort of say, hey, I'm gonna crowd out that incessant self-talk with Rupam Sunyata Sunyataiva Rupam, and it feels better to do that than to not do that. And then now we've got biological plausibility, I think, on chanting being an efficacious way of diminishing the fault mode network. Right. So I think that we have a really great scenario for another kind of big bang. In fact, like you're saying, biogenesis and a kind of really better be fairly large scale awakening to our true nature, which is not as these consuming beings that are separate from the environment that they live in, but as these emergent systems, as you described them, right? That who are collectively interdependent across different scales of phenomena. Right?
I think if we had such a kind of awakening on at a level of where there's kind of critical mass, I feel like it would entail certain kind of restructuring of our relationships, right? And last time we ended, you said that the word justice was something you wanted to pick up on next time. We were talking about, this stuff. And to me, it seems really obvious that you're talking about opening retreat centers and things like that, wellness centers. And it feels very much to me that the economy should basically be about taking care of each other. This is a sentiment I heard from David Graeber, the anthropologist. And it's like we should be spending our time in community, looking after each other, helping each other out, and that would extend to engaging in fun projects to build things we all enjoy. Most of the stuff that we get in the economy is to satisfy our needs and our wants, as well as psychotherapeutic, shamanic kind of psychedelic healing. But to me, that's the core of what we should be spending our time on, and I think that comes along with this vision that we're laying out.
I completely agree. And the simple word there, care, is such an important one there, because it's going to involve, as you said, I think we should be spending our time taking care of each other and taking care of ourselves. In other words, that I think it's arguable that we have reached a kind of level of global GDP, even if we just measure economic output that way, in those imperfect terms, in order to be able to say, like, okay, yeah, we're going to make a commitment, patchwork by patchwork, driven locally, right? But we're going to make a commitment that we're going to build a world that the human beings can allow the AIs to survive in, right? Because if not, right? I mean, if your hypothesis that the biogenesis is really the Big Bang, the AIs will have retroactively lamented the fact that they helped participate in global climate destruction, right? Because there'll be insufficient ecological complexity and footprint even for them to exist, right? I mean, and so even from the most kind of purely instrumental, like, Amazon forward thinking, it's like, we better have a world in which the servers are going to be able to run, that all starts to get solved on that scale, right? And so this is why I think I mentioned, again, I'm sure I sound hopelessly naive and simple-minded, but I think, there's a beautiful long tradition of mutual aid and the kind of, Schumpeter tradition of small is beautiful, of a kind of distributed systems of self-production that allow for kind of loosely governed structures where people's everyday lives are not really the subject of a nation state, but that they build infrastructure together that allows them to live sustainably with the economy, and that being involved in locomotion, walking or pedaling, in other words, like, seems to be a feedback loop on our consciousness where we actually feel connected to that environment in a different way than if we just travel through it. In other words, there's a kind of we get a hit of agency, if I can put it that way. Even if we're Benjamin Libet style creatures, that everything is always already unfolding for us, we get this sense that we're participating in the constitution of our own lives and our own environments in a way that I think is deeply lacking in people, and why they feel a sense of helplessness, because they're never involved even in their own transportation, right? In other words, that because they've been put into a situation where they have to be carried through various large-scale states. So I'm not saying, oh, well, bikes are going to solve that, but in the United States, for example, I think over half of all car trips are under 2 miles, which is perfect in most locations for a bicycle trip. If you just started to integrate that a little bit at a time, right, it would do at least as much as a vaccination against COVID, right, in terms of physical and mental wellness, right? And I think it would start to have other feedback loops as well. But I'm under no illusions it's going to be very difficult. So, and particularly around this concept of justice, because it's obviously the case that, you need only watch one or two Noam Chomsky documentaries to, or, read any, some small smidgen of his voluminous work to see that there is an awfully compelling case for the rapid march of structural inequality towards some kind of singularity of one person owning absolutely everything. We can call it the winner fuck all economy, right? And that it's just unmistakable that the larger those concentrations of wealth get, the more vulnerable they feel from, that they're on this kind of runaway process of infinite need, right? The writer William Burroughs talked about American society as being involved in, quote, the algebra of need, right? And that there's this kind of addiction profile to structure inequality that is like fairly unmistakable, right? So that, extraordinarily powerful and wealthy and increasingly the demiurges of our, existence, people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are taking on this almost Palmer Eldritch character in the Philip K. Dick novel, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. Like, Palmer Eldritch himself is a kind of amalgam of Trump and Musk and Bezos, right? And they're not going to go quietly, right? Like, in other words, they're going to trumpet the narrative of the authoritarian might of some illusory individual, and they're going to indulge their fantasy of that and continue their quest for corporeal and material immortality in the form of money, legacy, institutions, land, as in the case of Ukraine, right? And so, but to my mind, their narrative, their rapacious narrative, depends upon the kind of, it goes without saying, quality of that narrative for most ordinary, everyday, informed people across the planet. But only because we have been unable to portray a credible alternative. And to me, care being at the center of ecologically sustainable communities whose one of their main outputs is care, in fact, right? That is something that, as we go through the kind of conflagrations that the pandemic provoked, I think that people are voting with their feet and will vote with their feet, saying like, no, that is not a form of life that is sustainable for me. So I cannot participate in the master narrative. And so I'm going to reject the master narrative, right? And in rejecting the master narrative, I'm going to realize that, there's this whole system of structural inequality that involves racism and classism and so forth, that, a lot of people are probably, for the first time kind of waking up to. I think, though, a lot of the times, to me, and this is where it gets tender, there's a similar problem with the kind of one shot, and you're cured, right? That unlike, say, Martin Luther King or Gandhi, that we live in a society where, we're just like justice and moral outrage is our response to injustice. And we want that moral outrage to essentially be quenched. And justice is not the kind of thing, in my humble opinion, that yields itself simply to the quenching of moral outrage. That makes sense. And so, and it first and foremost involves actually the work that we have to do on ourselves, right? In order to disentangle the way in which that our sense of moral outrage and our sense of self-righteousness is contributing to the ego pandemic, which is driving the problem.
I think that's a really
racism and classism.
And important point, that the simplest response to how screwed up the world is to assert that you're to moralize and say, I'm better than these other people, I'm just inherently better, and to shame, and that's not really going to get us anywhere. And it's understandable that you might want an eye for an eye, or you might want something that feels like 100% recompense. But then when you look at how actually wise transformative justice happens in the world, it's a painful process of coming together, understanding, it's the messy kind of truth of being a human. And I think that's what,
it's like a messy divorce. Exactly.
Right.
It's just like, no, you're gonna muddle
when it's done well
it,
as well. Like when it's done right, you end up feeling hurt, and like, okay, well, we've resolved things enough that we can move forward. And what you hope is that in a healthy situation where harm, as biological beings, we're always going to step on each other's toes to some extent. And you hope that basically, as long as that balances out roughly, we can all live with that. The problem is the power dynamics become so entrenched and so relentlessly, the same people getting trodden on again and again. That's when it becomes, that's why it's understandable to have deep moral disgust and outrage. But if we're going to get out of this, we need to, I think, move into this. We need to heal ourselves and grow enough and have enough emotional bandwidth to engage in these kind of transformative processes. And I actually share with you this kind of optimism where, until recently, I would say I was very non-attached. Well, I wasn't non-attached, but I wasn't willing myself to be optimistic just for the sake of it. I probably felt quite pessimistic about
which is healthy.
Going.
Yes.
But then actually, I was kind of doing down my quest to understand our current social strife earlier. But actually, something that came out of it was, I was thinking how it seems that when we live in hunter-gatherer groups, the collective, like the healthy collective that's based in compassion and understanding, is an excellent container for egoic, the egoic desire to have a position of power and to be able to control others. And there are mechanisms in place where that gets kept in check, not in a way that where they feel kind of othered and like an outcast, but in a healthy way where they feel understood and seen. But then I think obviously with things like agriculture, where people can start to stockpile power, then that feeds into the potential for the ego to run away. But I was looking into this recent research from a few years ago, looking at the genetic history of Proto-Indo-European speakers, which the vast majority of people in the world, right, speak Proto-Indo-European language. And it actually seems kind of, the homeland seems to be around Ukraine. There's kind of, the steppes where the horse was domesticated. And from what we can see is that the males went out on horseback and basically, with axes, and would kill all the local men, sleep with the women, and then basically the process continues. And it turns out that strategy was a powerful replicator, and that laid the foundation.
Because they had stirrups, if I remember.
Right, and there was the Bronze Age as well, so
right,
it happens to come
they
together.
Had stirrups.
Right,
yeah.
And then you have this this is prehistory. This lays the foundation for all of the cultures from in Europe, and you've got the Vedic cultures through to the Celts, the Germans, the Latin cultures, and the ones in Europe that go on to be colonizers and to engage in similar kind of practice. And when looking at this, the thing that struck me is there's a story you could tell where when we're in community, there are naturally evolved human processes that keep us in equilibrium. That's a healthy state. And we naturally know how to engage in processes of kind of justice and making sure that everyone's healthy and taken care of and feels understood. Then when you get the horse, and you can basically, and Bronze Age technology, and you can go to somewhere else, basically. If you're going to rape and pillage in your own community, people aren't going to let you do that for long. And your own sense of empathy and connection to your family members and your friends most humans aren't capable of that.
Yes.
Right, and you're unaccountable. So I think the opposite of care is a desire. The opposite of being in webs of care is a desire for unaccountability. Like the ego, is just like, what if I could just go and do anything I wanted and no one could stop me?
Yes.
And I think that was kind of unleashed in this dynamic. But then if this is a correct way of looking at it, well, now in our global interconnected world, we're a global village now, right? We're
yes.
I don't like to bandy around the word tribe, but we're a united tribe again. And at the moment, we're struggling with how do we get back to this state. But now, when I saw it that way, I was like, actually, maybe our natural psychological processes are going to get us there. Maybe that's what we're going through now. I used to think, how is it that, what is it, a decade ago in both of our home countries, gay marriage wasn't legal, and you think it feels like you're living in the past, in medieval times or something. Now I look at it and think, well, actually, things are different now to medieval times, and there's a clear momentum out of that kind of barbarity. And maybe we are just engaging in this process of getting each other in check. And the extra piece is to move from the moralism, the egoic division, to this more difficult but more wise process of mutual understanding that comes along with a non-dual perspective, where you see no one's the true primary cause of their own behavior, and there's understanding and forgiveness to be had everywhere.
No, that's a beautiful. I love your longue durée treatment of the emergence of the colonizer and the colonized, and I really think that key there. I keep using this word infrastructure. Key there will be infrastructure, because as you said, the agricultural fall was the ability to store up wealth and energy, right? In some ways, that makes a lot of intuitive sense to me as well. And but as you know, there are like 15 different theories for the agricultural revolution, but I find that one compelling as well. And if we follow out its logic, then we see that okay, if we can move to more distributed system of energy creation, wealth creation, food production, water processing, like if we're actually moving away from that center and periphery model and more towards a kind of web of modular, integrable communities that are both geographically located and have dimensions, aspects elsewhere, as ours does right now, right? That you can no longer store up that wealth quite as effectively, right? And so that's my hope, and I do think that, as you know, as a scientist, that our ability to create falsifiable knowledge will create unbounded amounts of economic value, but we have to create those that economic value in accord with what we now know scientifically about the integration of those different layers of ecosystems and conscious beings and awareness. And so we're like, we ain't seen nothing yet in a way. Like we haven't even begun to tap the terawatts of solar energy that we're being bombarded with, right? That we could, everything that we could turn that into, right, is truly mind-boggling, right? It makes the kind of trillionaire fantasies of Bezos seem kind of like $1 million. You know what I mean? It's just like we're literally being bombarded with energy, right? You know, like, and so, but we've got to get there. We've got to get to that point, right? We've got to build a bridge to that place where we can shift from that still essentially kind of feudal model, right? You know, that capitalism kind of recapitulates that feudal model of sovereignty. But what's interesting is that it's coming all the way back around, that I think part of this awakening that we're pointing to, that I'm not embarrassed to point to, is that when we start practicing some of this healing that we're talking about, this self-repair, this care for ourselves and for each other, we see demonstrable proof that is unmistakably healing, right? So we can't simply forget it, as I mentioned earlier. But we also have no desire to exert ownership over it, right? That it's a kind of, you know, Lucretius said, pleasure fundamentally wants to be shared, right? That there's a kind of sharing modality. And I do, you know, like I haven't read Charles Eisenstein's new book on the gift economy, but I followed his thinking about it for many, many years. I do think we're ripe for thinking about how we can kind of financialize some of this mutual aid, right? So I'm excited about distributed, decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, as a way of trying to support these sorts of communities where we're learning how to recognize each other as emergent healing phenomena, right? So I think I shared that with you. I'm not sure. Did I share that write-up of that DAO with you, or I did not?
I don't think so.
I'll share it with you next time if you don't mind. It may not be to your taste, but it sort of came over me in a series of days, and I just wrote it up as a kind of governance document of how would you try to create an economic basis for the sharing of
That'd be
what
great.
I'm calling in the document satsang. Because until, go ahead.
So I read the Eisenstein book you mentioned, The Gift Economy. It was a good read. And also I mentioned David Graeber earlier, whose first kind of breakup book was Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which talks about indigenous kind of gift economics. Nice. And when I moved to this area of Portugal, you know, we're a kilometer away from a little village, and immediately we kind of, you start to notice this kind of gift economics dynamic where, you know, we have more olives than we can eat, more oranges than we can eat, and the guy up the road has more eggs from his chickens than he can use. And so there's this inherent just kind of, someone turns up and gives you some things, and then you feel there's this inherent social instinct to give back. But then Graeber writes about how in indigenous communities there tends to be this real taboo on giving exactly the same value back, because what you're saying there is like, I don't want anything to do with you anymore. We are done. We no longer have any business with each other. But you always want to give a little bit more, a little bit less. So you have an excuse to come around and say, you know, oh, you know, quick, let's give you. And he charts how money is basically all of those inherently violent, like, interactions where you're like, how much precisely do I have to give you so I never have to talk to you again? And it's all like disputes and reconciling them, which is a really fascinating evolution. So yeah, I'd love to read that.
Right, it loses a lot of the information content of the gift exchange, right? And again, Philip K. Dick was on this in Man in the High Castle. One of the central problems of the narrative is like, what gift should this high-ranking diplomat get this visiting back channel visitor from the Nazis in order to try to create peace. And the whole problem of the lack of any calculus for a gift, right? That it can't be exactly appropriate in a way. Like there has to be something anomalous about it that is not alarming, right? Like I'm going to make some to finally pay back one of those debts of potatoes from somebody who lives up the hill from me. I need to make some cordito, some spicy pickled cabbage, right? But like, I don't know how spicy to like it, you know? So there's this kind of very subtle community negotiation that like goes out where you try to figure out, and there's a kind of actual, and that just builds a little bit of a bond too, because like no matter what, once I give it to them, I'm like, okay, was that too spicy? Was that just right? You know what I mean? That there's real communication that happens that's nonverbal in those exchanges.
Also, kind of circling back on where you're talking about the kind of imagining a new economy that really moved into a sustainable mode, I think it really will come down to this sense of community, and do we have enough of a kind of a political awakening to make people realize the necessity of holding things in the commons? Because the option is we either move into having things in the commons where we all have access to energy and the things we need to live, or we end up with the situation where Bezos or whoever, most likely whoever's the billionaire who owns the company that gets across the finishing line first for artificial general intelligence, the economy collapses into a singularity. They have all the power. But then you see the economy for what it is, a feudal system where at that point, if we as the general populace have no purchasing power because the economy's been screwed by this singularity moment, then in what sense are they the wealthiest person in the world? It's because they have guards around them and they have big walls around them and they're stopping us from getting to the food and like owning the land. And that's already what's happening. That's the thing, right? But if you imagine that scenario, it shows you how it is feudalism, but just under there's an expression around it's like a polite form of feudalism, like these extra steps involved that we're currently living under, and those are the two futures, I think.
It's a long way around to it, like we took the long way back to it. We recapitulated the form. No, I agree entirely, and I think what's so fascinating is that the very infrastructure we're using right now to do this call, of course, emerged precisely through people need to be reminded in open source commons.
Right.
Where it was the internet was built out of the very who was the great legal theorist on this, Lawrence Lessig, wrote very persuasively, but everybody just kind of like ended up ignoring it because it's like, we think we just really want to make a lot of money off of this now, and we don't find your arguments about the commons to be very convenient. But it's not very convenient to overlook the fact that Linux, last time I looked at when people tried to do an economic valuation of Linux, it was approaching $1 trillion, piece of infrastructure in valuation. And that was produced out of the commons. So it's not this kind of like, oh, we're going to hold everything in common, so therefore everything will be scarce. No, right? Like that. But we've been there. Like we know how that works. That involves giving state control over that infrastructure. Right. Whereas if we have like watershed control, food shed control by, where it's governed by local, community, then we can start to expand that concept of the commons. Like there's what I find a very promising example that I wanted to bring up before, which is that under the pandemic, finally in the United States, school lunches were free for everybody, because the economic shock was such that all of these people who ordinarily would never ever have been in a situation where they couldn't have paid for their kids' lunch were in that situation. And there was a kind of implicit classist judgment in the past about like people who couldn't that kept it being something where you had to pay for your lunch. In other words, you're paying for your lunch so that you can demonstrate that you can pay for your lunch.
Right.
It creates the class difference between, but it hasn't come back, which I think is really, like, in other words, free lunch is still free. And I think it's because they're seeing it's like it is so cheap, okay? It's such a cheap way to actually deliver meals to an element of the populace that you have every reason to think, since I believe 1 out of every child in America lives under the poverty line, they have every reason to believe they could be in a situation where they're not going to get that meal. So it's like, boom, we took care of it. It's not trillions of dollars, right? It's a kind of relatively small marginal increase in that budget where, like, boom, you just solved that problem, right? So if we look at that on a biosystemic level, so if we look at that as an issue of food security, right, which is, in some ways some troubling language, that, like, a discourse, because the discourse of security never produces security in any other domain where it claims to. It's always about producing differentials of security and insecurity for different people. Nonetheless, I think there was a recognition in the pandemic of, like, we're a systemic society, we're able to scapegoat some members of that society and make them pay for something that they shouldn't have to pay for. Right. The world is not going to hell because everybody can eat free food. They're not. Right. Their obesity is not increasing.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
I think that's one of the more menacing things, is the way in which I think you could argue one of the major things that's wrong with society is the fact that trauma is not evenly distributed, and that's because there's an excess of trauma because we've lost our ability to ground ourselves in the environment and engage in kind of healing modalities. And instead of doing that and diffusing the potential for trauma, there's this kind of like crabs in a bucket, like stepping on each other to push other people into the trauma, and then, or like drowning people frantically stepping on others. And in that situation, if the kids with the, not living below the poverty line, the ability to not empathize, the ability to say they're poor, whatever, like, who cares? Like, that's the real vivid, like, psychopathy of the culture, which is, and the only way you can think that is if you feel a terror at the possibility that could be you, or, like, the fact that this level of trauma exists, you're like, just turn away from it, say whatever you have to say to get people to make you not think about it, because I don't see a solution. But if we have the solution of trauma healing, then that's the pressure valve that hopefully can release this dynamic.
Right. And I think, again, I want to return to this word justice, because I think that word justice comes up because it's become inescapably evident that trauma is unequally distributed, right? And that then we start to use the language in the United States of privilege as a way of labeling being without trauma, which I understand why that language is being used, but it doesn't create the conditions by which the trauma can be released, right? Where it needs to be released. So this is where I'm thinking, like, in terms of opiate crisis response, that, as you know, we lost 100,000 people in the U.S. last year to opiate addictions. The year that my brother died of an overdose, 1987, there were 1,700 people that died that year of an overdose. Now there's 100,000, right? And yes. And so part of, dealing with that opiate pandemic, I feel that has to be with precisely what you're talking about, is that, like, we need to teach people in contexts where they're supported how to allow themselves to be healed of those traumas, right? And so, for example, the other reason I'm extremely optimistic that can happen is that you say, oh, well, that's, very pie in the sky for you, kind of like American, probably liberal, academic, white guy, who doesn't have to worry about any of these things. But one of my teachers and collaborators is a man in Pittsburgh, Miguel Sage, who's a Taino shaman, Bahique. He's the lead teacher of the Taino tradition. The Taino, the first peoples that Columbus became in contact with. And he's in his 70s and has pretty much single-handedly reconstructed the entire shamanic tradition of the Taino people, even during a period of time when the Tainos were declared to be extinct by anthropologists. And his focus is almost entirely, I would say, on not only revitalizing, recontextualizing, remembering all of the forms of Taino culture that had been erased and effaced, and enacting them joyfully, but also that all those forms of culture are there precisely because they help us deal with the inevitable trauma of living in the material world that we live in, and that when we have erased and effaced these indigenous forms of knowledge or these other forms of knowing, we've really effaced and erased all these forms of medicine that we need right here, right now, right? And so the fact that somebody who's been through a very different journey, right, emigrating from Cuba in 1961, growing up in the United States, becoming an elementary school art teacher, a musician, and working for 40 years on creating his own spiritual circle without any kind of self-aggrandizement, whatever, writing a novel, recapitulating this Taino journey. It all comes back to that fundamental work that you were talking about, which is that healing work of opening to that trauma, accepting that trauma, right? Allowing that trauma to dissipate and healing as a result, and you can find that logic, as I'm sure you well know, replicated through therapeutic techniques of many different kinds, right? It's not a kind of complicated or proprietary form of knowledge, right? It involves a kind of care. It involves being there as someone else has that, works through their trauma. And we can do that for each other. We don't need, it's intriguing. We need guidance, but we don't need special degrees to do that. Right?
Right.
So, but it does take time and it does take attention. So if we could somehow incentivize that, because there aren't enough there's not enough therapists for the awakening, right? There's not enough shamans for the awakening, right? This is going to have to be a peer-to-peer
right.
Awakening. Same way the internet itself grew, same way, the distributed platforms grow. But I feel
totally right.
very optimistic that we're going to do it. But here's my, not concern, but, red flag is I'm observing as people are kind of silently trying to pretend that the pandemic never happened and that we can just kind of go back to normal, right? I think we might have talked about this last time, but that's the erasure narrative in its very essence, right? It's like, it was never normal, okay? Like, it was never normal. What we became aware of, because it reached the whole planetary scale, right, is that we are involved in collective interbeing with everyone else on the planet, and that there isn't a pandemic here or a pandemic there. There is the pandemic, right? And the same is true for all the globally scaled problems that we face, right? Which are the big problems. So by going back to normal, we mean like, let's fall back into this fantasy that nation states can just solve it on their own. It's just like not going to work. Again, I'm sure that sounds very pie in the sky. But for me, I think the thing I would emphasize to people is that this is a bottom-up vision. This is not a top-down vision. I'm not saying the United Nations are going to have a plenary session and decide that we're all going to transcend the ego epidemic, right? Like, please report to your local wellness facilities for your LSD. No, we don't want that, in fact, because that's the one-size-fits-all notion. No, we have to have patchwork community responses to healing each other, and by healing each other, then we, that person can heal somebody, and that person can heal somebody, and so on and so on and so on. Which, to me, the real injunction in the book of Matthew that Jesus gives to his disciples is go forth and heal. not like go forth and convince people that I am the only son of God, right?
Right.
Go forth, go build lots of churches.
Yeah,
It
it's
gets
like, guys, how
translated.
did you
It's
mess
like,
this up? I was really clear.
something got lost in the translation. Exactly. My Greek is not so good.
No, I think you're totally right that the
no, because
pandemic
it was that was like,
is hopefully like an opportunity for like this realizing that we are interconnected, we are this global community, right? And I mean, part of me feels like if psychedelic medicine had been 5 years ahead of where it's on now, the time course it's on now, and enough people had been familiar with it, and everyone's suddenly at home, off from work, like that could have, if things had come together in that way, that could have been the moment, and
oh
who knows,
wow,
maybe
yeah.
the
Well,
next
I think
pandemic
in a
will be.
way, we got to have another one.
Yeah.
Are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you are. Sorry, I was having trouble with my phone. Am I sideways now or something? I
Your
messed
video's
with
not
it,
on.
which is always a mistake.
The video's
Oh,
turned
okay.
off.
Let me try if I
There
can.
you go. Perfect.
Back?
Yeah, you're back.
Yes. Okay. So sorry about that.
That's right.
Right, and I think we can just sort of cheerfully insist on that, right? Like, here in the U.S., there was the mass resignation that happened in November. There's a labor shortage. So it's a good time to dictate terms to the future AIs, right? I mean, like, saying like, hey, now, here's how we want to live, okay? We want to be in a symbiotic relationship with this technological singularity. We're not interested in yoking this technological singularity, which has already occurred, right? We're not interested in yoking that technological singularity with the kind of like the old school fantasies of like one person like achieving absolute power. That's easily recognized as the kind of narcissistic ego myth that it is. And so, not going to work. Okay. Like brush up on your mythology. So, right. I mean, so I know, but like it's going to be interesting, right? I mean, it's going to get weird. I feel like we've turned so many turns past weird. Like when Eric Davis was doing his wonderful work on high weirdness, so it's like, well, once upon a time, high weirdness was weird enough, but like
Right. He
we're
needs to
way
come out with
past
higher
weird now,
weirdness
right?
now.
We've
Well,
I mean,
as everything gets weirder in the
but
future,
I
I would
think we get
love to continue these dialogues over. It's been really great talking to you.
oh, me
Probably
too.
bring
I
it to a
find them
close.
very healing. Yeah. I hope other people find them useful too.
I got great
We can
feedback
just
on the
share our
previous one.
transmissions
So.
and see. Good. Yeah, no, because that's the only reason. Otherwise, we should all just take care of ourselves, right? What's the point of blabbing on about it?
Yeah. Well, that's actually, I've been really appreciating the bird song in the
Is-
background of your side of the conversation, because we've been getting a bit heady and into ideas and stuff, but it kept bringing me back to just, we're saying all this, but the solution isn't to get lost in these thoughts and these ideas. And this moment, like if you can come back to just being where you are now and like try to ground yourself in that, like that's the real project, not the ideas.
Right, and of course the cardinal perched over here 10 yards from me, he knows that I sing some weird songs, and that I'm singing one of them right now.
You're singing giant steps to him, right? You mentioned Coltrane earlier.
Like human rationality. Remember, Darwin noted that the real analogy was not between humans and other primates when it came to the vocalization, but between humans and birds, right? Sexual selection operates on human speech, right, as seductive capacity, but also kind of, then bootstraps us into consciousness. So I think we're very funny kinds of birds indeed. I think, we are, I sometimes say that we're the abstract birds, right? Because we take the song and we then pull it onto the scale of abstraction, which, like, I listen to the Cardinals pretty closely here, and their songs all slightly different, or like in different spaces, and over the course of the season and so forth, they play out different things, but it's all the same song, right? They never start. They never do to their song what Coltrane did to a few of my favorite things, right? Which is to abstract it and remake it. And so I do that with the birds plenty of times. I whistle back to them and pull things in and out. And I'm sure, my neighbors already, wonder what a strange bird is up here. But the point is that these are non-trivial components of our environment. They're not just nice things to see. And maybe this is the way we should close it out, that ecodilia is part of not only our birthright, but it's a necessary aspect of our function as autopoietic systems of self-repair, right? That we co-evolved with environments like this, in those communities that you described in patchworks of tribes. And so we ought not be surprised that as we heal ourselves, as the counterculture did in the 1960s, that we start borrowing appropriately or inappropriately this language of tribes and the forms of organization that are proper to them, precisely because they're scaled more to the local ecology, right? I mean, they're not always necessarily scaled more to the local ecology, but they tend to be.
Right.
But anyway, we'll take off on that next time. We both probably got to do something.
Yeah, no, I love the birdsong analogy as well. I mean, I think it also points. We mentioned earlier how, like, in addition to the kind of competitive Darwinian drive in evolution, there's also this mutual aid dynamic that we often overlook. When I'm eating the apple and the seeds are getting passed on and fertilized, that's a mutually beneficial dynamic, right? And with the birdsong, if what we're doing right now is a form of birdsong, I'm inclined to say it's not that we're competitively trying to lure mates, to increase our genetic progeny, but it's a song of mutual aid, right? It's a song of helping.
Yeah, I'll share with you a piece I wrote on it about, like, bootstrapping noosphere with the analogy of birdsong. Yeah, no, we're creating the collective knowledge commons. Right. We're overcoming our individuality.
Right.
So beautiful. Yeah, always great to listen to you.
Yeah, same.
I'm going to be thinking a lot about those horses on the steps there.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.